The projector screen behind Silas flickered, magnifying his terrified face to 20 feet high for the entire shareholder meeting to see. I watched from the back of the room as the murmurs of 300 investors turned into a roar of outrage. He clawed at his tie, gasping for air, looking for an exit that didn't exist. 2 minutes ago, he was the king of the world. Now, he was a fraud exposed in 4K resolution. But before I tell you how my stepbrother's empire crumbled into dust in a single afternoon, I have to take you back 72 hours. Back to the moment he thought he had finally buried me. The winter wind in Chicago cuts through you like a rusty blade. I stood by the open grave, the snow crunching under my dress shoes, feeling the numbness spread from my toes to my chest. My father was being lowered into the frozen earth, and the only heat I could feel came from the glare of the man standing opposite me. Silas, my stepbrother. He wore a cashmere coat that cost more than my car, and his eyes weren't on the coffin. They were fixed on the silver pocket watch I was clutching in my gloved hand. It was an old thing, dented and heavy, ticking with a rhythmic heartbeat that had comforted me since I was a child. It was the only thing Dad had left me directly. Everything else, the logistics company, the real estate, the liquid assets had gone into the trust, and Silas controlled the trust. "Hand it over, Ewan," Silas whispered, his voice low enough that the priest couldn't hear, but sharp enough to slice through the wind. "It belongs to the estate. It belongs to the CEO." I tightened my grip on the cold metal. "He gave it to me, Silas. It's not listed in the assets." "Everything is an asset," he hissed, stepping closer. The smell of his expensive cologne mixed with the scent of damp earth. "And you know the clause. Any dispute over personal effects freezes your access to the stipend. Do you want to starve, little brother, or do you want to give me the watch?" I looked at him. Really looked at him. This wasn't about the watch. It was about dominance. It was about erasing every trace of affection our father had ever shown me. I handed it to him. That was his first mistake. He thought my compliance was weakness. Psychologists call this the illusion of control, the tendency for people to overestimate their ability to control events. Silas believed he was playing a game of chess, but he didn't realize he had just picked up the one piece that was rigged to explode. Silas snatched the watch, his thumb rubbing over the engraving on the lid. He smirked, a tight, cruel expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Smart choice," he said. He slipped the watch into his pocket. "Don't bother coming to the office on Monday. I'm restructuring. Your position is redundant." I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I just watched the snow settle on his shoulders and nodded. As I walked away from the gravesite, the wind howled. But for the first time that day, I didn't feel cold. I felt the burning heat of a plan clicking into gear. The next 48 hours were a blur of calculated silence. I stayed in my small apartment, surrounded by stacks of financial reports I had secretly copied over the last 6 months. The heating in my building was broken, and I could see my breath in the air as I worked. I wrapped myself in a blanket, analyzing the discrepancies in the company ledgers. Silas had been skimming off the top for years, hiding it in shell companies. But he was sloppy. He was arrogant. I knew he would try to sell the logistics arm of the company immediately. He needed the quick cash to cover his gambling debts, another secret I had uncovered. But to sell, he needed the master key authorization. In the old days, that was a physical key. In the digital age, it was a code. But our father was old-fashioned. He had linked the digital authorization to a physical token, the pocket watch. Silas didn't know that. He thought it was just a trophy. On Monday morning, my phone buzzed. A notification from the company's internal server, which I still had access to thanks to a backdoor I'd installed months ago. Silas had scheduled an emergency shareholder meeting for Wednesday. Subject: strategic liquidation and new leadership. He was going to sell the company piece by piece, destroy our father's legacy, and run with the money. I grabbed my coat. It was time to play the role of the desperate, defeated brother. I waited for him in the lobby of the headquarters. The building was a glass monolith, reflecting the gray winter sky. When Silas walked in, flanked by 2 security guards, he looked like he owned the city. "Silas," I called out, injecting a tremor into my voice. "Please, we need to talk." He stopped, checking his reflection in the glass elevator doors. "I told you, Ewan. You're redundant. Security, remove him." "It's about the watch," I shouted as the guards grabbed my arms. "Dad told me it needs to be wound a specific way. If you overwind it, the spring snaps. It's fragile." Silas laughed. It was a dry, barking sound. He pulled the watch from his pocket, dangling it by the chain. "It's a machine, Ewan. Like you. It does what it's told." He stepped into the elevator, the doors closing on his smug face. This is where the Dunning-Kruger effect kicked in hard. Silas was so incompetent regarding the actual mechanics of the legacy he inherited, he couldn't recognize his own ignorance. He assumed the watch was just jewelry. He didn't know it was a biometric authenticator disguised as an antique, and by warning him about winding it, I had just guaranteed he would fiddle with it. I let the guards drag me out to the sidewalk. As soon as they released me, I straightened my coat. The desperation vanished from my face. I walked around the corner to a coffee shop, opened my laptop, and connected to the building's network. I watched the logs. 10:15 a.m. Silas enters the CEO's office. 10:30 a.m. Silas attempts to access the secure server to initiate the sale. Access denied. 10:35 a.m. Silas tries again. Access denied. I sipped my black coffee. It tasted bitter, like burnt earth. I could imagine him up there, sweating in his tailored suit. The system would be prompting him for the physical token interface. 10:45 a.m. Access granted. He had figured it out. Or rather, he had done exactly what I manipulated him to do. He had plugged the watch into the custom dock on the desk, a dock Dad had installed years ago, which looked like a simple display stand. What Silas didn't know was that the watch didn't just authorize the sale. When connected to the dock, it uploaded its internal memory. And for the last year, every time I visited Dad, I had been uploading the evidence of Silas's embezzlement onto that watch's encrypted drive. Tuesday passed in agonizing slowness. I needed Silas to feel confident. I needed him to walk into that shareholder meeting thinking he was untouchable. I spent the day visiting the locations Silas was trying to sell, the warehouses, the dispatch centers. I saw the workers, men and women who had been with us for 20 years, looking worried. They knew something was wrong. They could smell the rot at the head of the company. I spoke to the foreman, Mike. "Trust me," I told him, my hand on his shoulder. "Just keep the trucks running for 24 more hours." Mike looked at me, his eyes tired. "He's going to gut us, isn't he, Ewan?" "He's going to try," I said. "But the thing about gutting a fish is that if you slip, you cut your own hand." Wednesday, the day of the meeting. I used my old key card to get into the building. Silas had revoked my digital access, but he had forgotten to physically deauthorize the card ID in the basement security terminal. Classic oversight. I slipped into the auditorium before the lights went up. I hid in the back row, behind a pillar. The room filled quickly. Suits, ties, laptops. The air smelled of tension and expensive perfume. Silas took the stage. He looked impeccable. The pocket watch was chained to his vest, gleaming under the stage lights. He tapped the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice booming, "today marks a new era, an era of profitability, an era where we trim the fat." He clicked a remote. The massive screen behind him displayed a graph showing projected profits. Pure fiction. "I have secured a buyer for the logistics division," Silas continued, pacing the stage like a predator. "This sale will triple our stock value overnight." A hand went up in the front row. "Mr. CEO, what about the rumors of missing funds from the pension accounts?" Silas didn't blink. Baseless slander, probably started by disgruntled former employees. He looked directly at the empty seat where I should have been. "My administration is transparent." "Is it?" I whispered to myself. I pulled out my phone. I had remote access to the presentation computer. The watch was still docked in the system upstairs. Silas had left it there to keep the authorization active during the meeting, broadcasting the signal. I initiated the file swap. "As you can see on this next slide," Silas said, "our assets are robust." He clicked the remote. The graph disappeared. In its place, a video file opened. It was grainy footage, a hidden camera angle from inside the CEO's office. It was dated 3 months ago. The room went silent. On the screen, Silas was on the phone. "I don't care about the safety regulations." The recorded Silas shouted, "Cut the brake maintenance budget. I need that cash to cover the Vegas loss before the old man finds out." The real Silas on stage froze. He clicked the remote frantically. "Technical difficulty," he stammered. "Turn it off." But the video continued. It cut to a document, a scanned ledger showing millions of dollars funneled into an account named S Prime Holdings. Then the audio from the watch itself played. Dad's voice, frail but clear, recorded weeks before he died. "Ewan, I know what Silas is doing. I've stored the proof on this watch. If he takes the company, use it. Save our legacy." The auditorium erupted. It wasn't just murmurs anymore. It was shouting. "Is this real? He stole the pension fund. Call the SEC." Silas dropped the remote. He looked small. The giant screen magnified his panic. He turned to run, but the doors at the back of the room opened. I stepped out from behind the pillar. Silas saw me. His face went pale, then red. "You," he screamed, pointing a shaking finger. "You did this. You hacked the system." "I didn't hack anything, Silas," I said, my voice carrying over the chaos. "I just let you use the key you stole." I walked down the aisle. The investors parted for me like the Red Sea. I climbed the stairs to the stage. Silas backed away, tripping over his own feet, until he hit the podium. "The watch," I said, holding out my hand. He looked at the crowd. He looked at the screen where his crimes were looping on repeat. He looked at the security guards who were now moving toward the stage. Not for me, but for him. With trembling hands, he unclipped the watch from his vest. He dropped it into my palm. "It's over, Silas." The police arrived 10 minutes later. They led him out in handcuffs, the flash of press cameras blinding him, the public humiliation he had always feared. He had wanted to be the center of attention. Now he was. I stood on the stage, the heavy silver watch ticking in my hand. I looked at the investors, who were now looking at me for answers. "We're not selling," I said into the microphone, "and we're putting the money back." I walked out of the building into the winter air. The wind was still biting, but the storm had broken. I opened the watch. The picture of my mother and father inside seemed to smile. Silas wanted the crown so badly he forgot that a crown is just a heavy hat if you don't have the head for it. He is currently awaiting trial for fraud embezzlement, and corporate negligence. I visit him sometimes, not to gloat, just to check the time. I turned him in and watched his life burn down on live television. But sometimes, late at night, I wonder, he was my brother. Maybe if I had intervened sooner, instead of letting him dig his own grave, he could have been saved. Was this justice, or did I let my own resentment turn me into something just as cold as he was? If you held the evidence that could destroy your family, would you release it to the world? Be honest in the comments.